start of today's extravaganza. Really delighted to welcome you here in person and also online, those of you behind the screen somewhere. I believe there's quite a few who have joined us. We were determined not to be put off by the rail strike, and we've had people travelling here from Plymouth, I think is the furthest away. So very grateful to everyone for the effort that they have made. I'd like to welcome John Casken and also Camden Reeves. And they're here because we're celebrating the inaugural Tippett Award, which is being awarded to John Casken for the Shackled King. Now, we thought it was fitting to start off this celebration with a conversation between John Casken and another esteemed composer, Camden Reeves, really to look at the work and to give us an understanding of it. And at the end of the conversation, there will be a chance for some questions, and then we'll have the presentation of the Tippett Award, followed by a wine reception where we'll toast toast John and also Jeff Dean. So please join me in welcoming John Casken and Camden Reeves for their conversation.
Okay, so hello everybody and welcome John. So we're going to talk about John's piece, The Shackled King. We might get onto whether it is or is not an opera as part of the discussions, but if it's okay with you, John, I thought we should start by seeing and hearing some of this magnificent work. Mm-hmm. So we've got a clip prepared. Would you like to tell us briefly what it is we're going to see?
Yes. Well, the work is based on Shakespeare's King Lear, and it's not the whole play, it's aspects of it. It's about the relationship between Lear and Cordelia, and also Lear and the Fool. And it's the opera, I can call it that, starts at the end where Cordelia and Lear are in prison, and then the structure of the whole work is a series of flashbacks. And the first flashback is when Lear announces he's going to divide the kingdom into three, and he invites his three daughters to say how much they love him, and depending on their answer, that determines the size of the kingdom they will get. The first daughter, Goneril, says, "I love you more than anything," and then Regan stands up and says, "No, I love you even more than that." And Cordelia is the only one who honestly says, "If I say I love you more than anything, then what do I say to my husband?" And so the extract we're going to see, I think it's the second daughter, Regan.
What says our second daughter? Our dearest Regan, speak! But now, our joy, although our last and least, what can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak!
Nothing, my lord.
Nothing?
Nothing.
nothing will come of nothing. Speak again.
Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth.
We've got a glimpse of what a fantastic piece of writing that is, and we have the wonderful voices of Sir John Tomlinson and Rosanna Maidless. I've seen the work twice. I saw that performance, which was performed during lockdown, wasn't it, and streamed online or in that interim period.
Yes, it was going to be performed live as part of the Shakespeare and Music Conference at the University of Manchester. But because of COVID, we couldn't do it. And so in discussions with Michel Assay, we managed to make a film of it in December 2020, so that we got a record of it. And then that film was shown as part of the Manchester Conference. And it's extraordinary. It's 4 instruments. It's a very difficult ensemble of violin, trumpet, saxophone, and piano. 2 singers, no conductor. And how they got it together, I don't know. I asked myself the same question on Tuesday evening. It's a very happy week for the Shackled King, because on Tuesday the work was performed at the Newbury Spring Festival in Berkshire. They hadn't done the work for 10 months. They had 1 day's rehearsal. And then they gave the most fantastic performance. It is remarkable to work with artists of that quality.
I saw a performance at the Buxton Festival, and I think it was hearing it live again. I was particularly knocked out, but it's great to hear it's still going, and you had a performance earlier this week. I wanted to start the conversation about how you came to the Shackled King, but I wanted to start a very long time ago, because in 1991, was it, you received the Britain Award, which 31 years before, and I suppose the symmetry is not lost on you, that you received the Britain Award for Golem, which was your first opera, and then 31 years later you received the Tippett Prize for the Shackled King. So clearly drama is something you're good at, because when you do it you receive these big prizes. So I would encourage you to keep doing it. But there have been other instances of that. Still Mine won a big prize, which is for... Is it male voice and
it's for baritone and orchestra,
yes.
Yes.
And The Dream of the Rood, another theatrical work, which you won a prize for that. So clearly drama is something you're very good at. So I wondered if you could maybe recount a little bit briefly your relationship with music for the stage, with opera, how this fits into your output as a whole, and indeed your other music. But the journey, how you came to Shackled King from Golem to this.
Well, the more I've worked as a composer, the more I realise how important words are to me, which came as a big surprise. But the first work I think that really registered was I wrote a work in 1980 for the Bath Festival called Firewhirl, and it was for soprano and 7 instruments, and it's about a Finnish midsummer bonfire party. Very dramatic story, and I approached it as a drama. And I think every time I use a text, I always try to find at the heart of it its dramatic potential. And I use that phrase tellingly because subsequently I went on in 1989 to finish my first opera, Golem, which was commissioned by Pierre Audi for the Almeida Festival. And he said to me, he's a French-Lebanese intellectual, and he said to me, you know, no one has tested the dramatic potential of your music, and I want to see if you're up to it. And I thought, okay, that's the gauntlet laid down. I'm going to rise to that. And we searched for 9 months together, which is a very symbolic period of time, to find a suitable subject, and eventually landed on the subject of the Jewish legend of the golem. Right. And I had hoped to engage a librettist. That failed. Then a poet friend offered to be the librettist, and that failed. And I said, okay, I'll do it myself. So I wrote my own libretto for the opera, drawing on as much as I could from outside sources, from the Old Testament, from the Book of Psalms, from William Blake and so on, and Walt Whitman, and formed this text. Now, it made me realize that not only do I love working with other people's words, I very much enjoy excuse me, creating my own. So when you refer to the Dream of the Rood, which is for the Hilliard Ensemble, and it's my own adaptation of the 8th century early English dream poem, The Dream of the Rood. Yeah. And rather than set the whole thing, which is enormous, I did my own adaptation of it and created a condensed poetic version of it. So words have been important to me for a very long time and continue to be so. And particularly recently, as I've written more and more choral pieces. I started an amateur chamber choir in North Northumberland, where I live, about 13 years ago, and I've written a lot of pieces for them. And what I find is the more I want to write pieces for them, the more I want to find texts which are suitable to be set, and not all of them are.
Right, okay.
So when it comes to the Shackled King, the way this arose, the group Counterpoise, this is my third work for them, excuse me. The same ensemble, violin, trumpet, saxophone, and piano. The first work is called Deadly Pleasures, and it's a melodrama, and it's for a narrating voice. So it's a literal melodrama. The second work is Kokoschka's Doll, and it's a work about the relationship of the artist Kokoschka to Alma Mahler, for which I wrote my own text.
That's a fairly recent piece, isn't it?
Yeah, 2016, yeah, 17, something like that.
Also for Sir John Tomlinson.
And that was the first work I wrote for Sir John Tomlinson. When I knew he was going to be Kokoschka, I thought, this is great, but it can't be a speaking voice. He's got to sing for me. So what I did was combine the idea of speaking and singing and everything on the scale in between. So you get spoken voice, spoken text, normal spoken, rhythmicized speech, half sung, half spoken, proper Sprechgesang, all the way up to singing. And after we'd finished recording Kokoschka's Doll, Barry Millington, who runs the group Counterpoise, and his wife Deborah Calland, had been talking about the idea of turning King Lear into some kind of music theatre piece. And there are plenty of examples of composers who have worked on King Lear. There's Alexander Goer, Aribert Reimann, for example. And what was interesting was that John Tomlinson had just undertaken to perform King Lear as the play. And their idea was that all the actors in this production would be opera singers, as an interesting experiment to see really how well opera singers can act and what new things can they bring that stage actors can't. And this came together very nicely, and John said, I think this is a great idea. And very quickly he sent me his ideas for how we could use King Lear with only 2 singers. And I received his ideas and I battered my ideas back. And then it was a series of exchanges until I'd said, absolutely, we've now got the text, I'll begin.
It's a very unusual take on the Lear story, because I don't know how many people here have had the privilege of seeing your work, but it's not a setting of King Lear, is it? It's a sort of, it's set in the future, but beyond what happens in the play, with sort of memories of what's happened before. Could you tell us a little bit about that? And I'd be interested to know where that idea came from.
It was John's idea that we focus on the end of the play, because he was particularly interested in the final scene between Lear and Cordelia when they're in prison.
Yep.
And then the idea developed of having flashbacks, of going back to the division of the kingdom. And I insisted that we then go back to where we started.
You insisted?
Yes, yeah. To the prison scene. And then we have another flashback to the relationship between Lear and the fool. And then we go back to the prison. Now, I did this because the thing that music can do in opera or with drama that you can't really do on the stage unless you design it that way is music, of course, allows time for reflection. You can slow things right down. You can pause things in the way that you couldn't really on the stage. So as soon as you sing something, you elongate the words. You make things last much longer. The other thing that you can do is you can indulge in a lot of repetition, which actually, if you were doing Shakespeare, you wouldn't do that because it goes like a rocket from beginning to end.
Yeah.
And I'd done that with Kokoschka's doll. Use the idea of memory, that you restart. This is an idea that Birtwistle used an awful lot. I'll repeat, but maybe the repeat's not exactly as you remember it.
Do you think that setting it in the future, where there's a lot of in the future within the context of the play, gives more space for the music? Because I was thinking about that, and I think one of the difficulties in writing any kind of opera, I've never done it because I don't know how, but is that it becomes just basically a play that's sung, which can quite often crowd the music out. And there's a lot of contemporary opera like that, where you think the music is really a film score, and the vocal parts are just recitative, and it could be a film, and they're just singing, I don't know why, and they're not really singing. But that's not the case here, because there's a lot of musical content there, and there are particular musical ideas that develop. I was going to talk about the motto perpetuo thing, which seems to develop throughout it. There's a lot of space for the music. Was that the thinking, or was that an unconscious thing? Or
Well, it's partly unconscious in the sense that I don't know where it comes from, but I tend increasingly to rely on instinct, and I think that my instinct with the words is often tells me, where and how I should go with the material. But I think that you're absolutely right. The big danger in setting Shakespeare is that you're so overwhelmed by the magnificence of the words that you feel you have to get them all in. And that wasn't the case. And I had the advantage in the sense that, having decided that my vocal line was going to be spoken and sung, that if I had some bits of Shakespeare which were really tricky, well, they would be spoken. That's a solution. But then when there are obvious arias within the Shakespeare play that Cordelia can sing, then you allow yourself lots of space, but also space in between things. I have to say that we don't start at the beginning of any scene. We take Shakespeare, all the words of Shakespeare's, but it's a bit like the Morecambe and Wise and Andre Previn sketch, that they're in the wrong order, But it makes literal sense because we are flashing back all the time.
So you've mentioned that a couple of times about this. You have speaking, you have Sprechstimme, you have recitative, you have rhythmicized speech. So there's this entire continuum from speaking to singing. I want to come on to that in a minute, but I want to talk briefly a little bit about Wagner and then Alban Berg. But there's a reason for that, because with Kokoschka's doll, there are vestiges of Tristan that go all the way through that. And I suppose there's part of me that's wondering whether you can't escape Wagner when you're writing for the person who basically owns Wotan in our lifetime, and whether there was an element of that there. But Wagner is, I suppose, the composer who really started that idea that the musical content is kind of happening as this backdrop, and what's happening on the stage is this kind of... But then Alban Berg, who's a composer, I know there's this kind of anti-Wagner thing that happens, and you find it in Britain as well. And his way of making sure there's space for the music was to have these kind of musical set pieces that are going on in the substructure. So music is never crowded out. But it strikes me as, in a way, I heard bits of Wagner in this, but less so than in Kokoschka's doll, because there is actually Wagner in there, isn't there?
There is. I mean, Wagner's in Kokoschka's doll for the simple reason that when Alma Mahler started to seduce Kokoschka, her father invited him to a supper party, and she took a shine to him, as they say. Is that the right expression? And they went into the music room, and she played and sang the Liebestod for him, and he was completely smitten. And this idée fixe in their relationship was always there. And so the interesting thing was I wanted to use the Tristan quotation, or some of the Liebestod anyway. And I thought, I can't do this too obviously because, I'll get criticized for it. So I used it, and Barry Middleton said, I thought you were going to use Wagner. And I said, it's there. And I think he showed it to Arnold Whitall, and Arnold said, it's not obvious at all. So I thought, okay, well, I made it more obvious, and I think now it is about right, but it is definitely there. But it's there in the sense that you think, it's gone. And that is the trick, is not to use it as a kind of a calling card.
And this is what I'm wondering about in The Shackled King, because, of all the pieces of Wagner, Tristan and Isolde, it's sort of twisting tonality, bringing tonality in and out of focus. Yeah. And you do that very convincingly with found material in Kokoschka's Doll. What I noticed going on here, and I haven't put this past John in advance because I'm interested to know what but I heard two different parallel continuums going on in the work. One is this sort of continuum from speech through to song and everything in the middle, but also this continuum from the non-tonal through to the very recognizably tonal. And that same for me, it was a sort of kaleidoscope. I don't know if you remember having those things that you turn as a kid and the colours will go. And for me, it's like that with tonality. But what I noticed was that it seemed to me that when Cordelia was being Cordelia, there wasn't much of a tonal focus. But when we go into the memories and things are happening before, it's like this tonal lens comes into play. It might not be happening quite the way I've seen it there, but there's something going on, and you can really feel these gears twisting in what it does to the drama of these two parallel continuums going on between spoken and sung and what was the other one? Tonal, non-tonal, yeah, and modal, and everything in between, modal and yeah.
Well, I think it's important to play with expectations. I think, in terms of one's musical language, when I was much younger, I remember saying to one of my colleagues at Birmingham, John Joubert, who was my teacher, when he said to me, one of the most important things in music is tonality. And I said, that's nonsense, because I was an arrogant young composer. And I think he's absolutely right. And the older I've got, but it's not tonality in the sense that, we would normally refer to it. It's things coming in and out of focus.
It is somewhere, though. There are key signatures in the score.
There are, and exactly at the point where Cordelia, in the flashback to the memory of when she says to her father, "I love you dearly, but I can't say that you have all my love." Yes, it's in a key signature because I wanted that sense of honesty, truthfulness, and innocence. Of all of them, there are two people in the play who have that quality, and one is Cordelia, and the other person is the fool. The fool is the one person in the play who is able to tell the king some hard truths, but he does it through enigmas, through riddles all the time, and that I found very difficult to deal with musically. So the music, when the fool is there, is either a bit like a pantomime in places, and at other times almost like musical games and jokes.
Yeah, to me it seemed to be the places where Regan appears and where Goneril appears that these tonal it sort of goes into B flat minor quite a few times, A major, B flat minor, this weird Neapolitan thing, which also has that sense of shifting you out of the Neapolitan has that effect, doesn't it? Oh, we're another universe. But am I just picking it? Is this some weird analysis I've done?
I can't quite recall what I do. But if you say that's the case, then I believe you.
Oh, it is, definitely.
But I think the insincerity of Goneril and Regan I needed to capture somehow in music. And if you're working, teasing out something from a kind of a subtonal stratum, it's rather perhaps more interesting to do that than just composing any old thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sorry, anyway.
Well, I wanted to get you onto Berg, really, because, I mean, we've had this conversation off mic for many years, this admiration you have for the music of Alban Berg, which I share. For me, it's about as glorious as harmony has ever been and ever could be. It's just marvellous. And I know, but Wozzeck and Lulu, you know, there's that similar kind of twisting and turning of tonality, atonality, coming in and out of focus, but also that relationship between speaking. And could you tell us about Berg and his dramatic works and how that relates to what you do?
Well, one of the very nice things about being here in Leeds is that I went to school in Barnsley, which is just down the road. And between Barnsley and Leeds is a wonderful Cathedral of Wakefield where I had organ lessons. So this little corner of Yorkshire is rather dear to me. And it was in Barnsley, my music teacher who, he was, well, anyway, he did some very useful things. One afternoon he said, I'm just going down to the staff room. He said, there's a bit of music here that I think you should get to know. And so I put the 78s on the turntable, and it was Berg's violin concerto. And he said to me, I don't reckon much to this, but I think you should get to know it. And he did me a great favor because I'd never heard it before, and it really opened my eyes. And I spent the next N years in this glorious, ignorant admiration of Alban Berg. Ignorant because I didn't have the score, I didn't analyze, I didn't study it. But I kept being, every time I heard his music, I kept being drawn to it. And when I got to know it much better, I found that what was wonderful was that a lot of it was unbelievably rational, like in the lyric suite or the violin concerto, but just glorious in its humane expression as well. And that's always been my big ambition, to try to make sure that my music has some kind of integrity, but it's not so wound up in its own devices that it doesn't communicate, it doesn't reach out, it doesn't express feeling.
But the thing about Berg, of course, is that, I mean, his relationship to tonality, atonality, you said, you know, your view on things as a young composer. I mean, he's the one composer that seemed to want to embrace everything of that second Viennese school, and to be able to appropriate the serial method to make it do whatever he wanted. Yeah. And I remember you telling me that in your earlier works you used to make these big grids, harmonic grids. I remember doing that as a student. I don't know how much that's still there, but that's that sort of Bergian rationalism. But how has your approach changed?
Well, I think, you know, remember that I was studying at university in the late 1960s at Birmingham.
Right.
And this was the time where, you know, Boulez, Stockhausen, Berriot, Messiaen were currency. And it was at Birmingham that I came across Penderecki and Tippett for the first time. And I did my undergraduate dissertation on Prokofiev's symphonies and thought, oh yes, this is something worth exploring. And there was one man at Birmingham who took over when I did my master's, Peter Dickinson. And he said, you're going to analyze some Messiaen and some Stockhausen and some Boulez, and you're going to come to terms with Cage, etc. And this was such a rude awakening for me. And it made me think, or made me want, in fact, to compose music in such a way that it somehow embraces what was then called the avant-garde. And it was during the course of that year that Peter came with a great pile of scores of Lutosławski and said, I think you might be interested in these. Well, I was so interested that very soon I was actually in Warsaw on a Polish government scholarship. And I subsequently met Lutosławski and formed a very close friendship with him. So as a young composer, there was this feeling that there was a certain way of doing things. And it was very difficult, but it was sort of straightforward. I knew the direction in which I had to go. It was a modernist direction. And actually things were changing in the world of music, but they were also changing for me, because the more I wrote, the more I realized that I had to find something broader and more generous, emotionally more generous. And it was Golem, my first opera, that made me realize that if the words are right, the music will be right. And if the music changes from being hardline modernist to Kurt Weill or Fiddler on the Roof, providing you can account for that dramatically, that's fine. That's absolutely great. And this has been my view ever since, that, you know, if you can find the right music to bring to life an idea or a vision that you have, whether it's a poetic vision or whether you're working with words or even something more abstract, then providing that it satisfies your ears as a composer, then that's what you've got to do. And where I am now is, I've used the word instinct already. I am much more instinctive now. So the grids served a great purpose in the 1980s. 90s, I think I just about started to put them to one side. And now they don't exist at all.
I still hear them, though. I mean, I still hear that rigor, because I've been through the score, and what blows me away as a fellow composer the whole time is the craftsmanship that underlies everything. And
Careful, you'll think that we've rehearsed this.
No, but I don't know. I don't know if it's something that composers have to go through when they're younger, which is to, in a way, it's almost a way of training your ear and finding your language, that you have to come up with these processes, these mechanisms to find what you're trying to do. But you get to a point where you can let go of that, because it's the same way as learning the piano. I think I said this to you before, that when you start learning the piano, you're very aware of which finger you're putting where and which fingerings you should use, and you're doing it all very rationally. But eventually you get to the point where you're not thinking about that at all, and you can just, it's not you let it go, but there's something about composition that the process of letting go happens less organically. Or at least it did for me. I don't know. It's kind of like, I can actually let that go now.
Yeah,
that's what it felt like for me.
Well, I think it comes with age as well. I think that the interesting thing about grids is that the grids don't produce the music. I think that one creates grids that will create a certain harmonic spectrum, or that within the grids you're looking for something, and the grid is a sort of a way of almost justifying what you want to do anyway.
Interesting. Yeah. So what are you working with now? Because the craft is clear to the ears. Are there principles that you're using to get you through certain situations? And what are they?
The principles are coherence and clarity. And I don't know what else to say, because, I mean, nothing is pre-planned anymore.
Nothing at all. Okay. So let me go to some specific bits in the opera which really struck me. Some of the most striking music, which is, I was going to pick two passages which recur throughout. I mentioned one of them already. And what strikes me about these two passages, one is incredibly simple and one is incredibly complex, and they're both really striking. There's this claves music that begins the piece, where you ask the players of the ensemble to put down their instruments and they pick up claves, and it sort of sounds like rattling bones. I don't know if that's the chains of the cage, or whether there are skeletons hanging around or whatever. And that recurs several times between the scene changes, apart from between the final two scenes, if I'm right. That you leave it out there, and then it comes back at the very end.
It's an oral signal to tell the audience that actually we're back where we started, which is at the very end of the play. And we're going to relive those moments where Lear thinks he recognizes this young woman. Is it Cordelia? Is she actually there, or is she there in his memory? It's all very ambiguous. She may not be there at all. But the claves came to me as an idea to create this a rather unusual start to the piece. So there are four instrumentalists playing claves. It's surprisingly difficult to get instrumentalists to play claves.
Claves are hard to play.
They are, yes.
Because you have to...
They're also difficult to find. Anyway, where I live. So yes, bones or dripping water. I mean, it's all that. It's, you know, what sounds might you experience in a dungeon far beneath the earth. There's a very strange thing that a composer I knew was Toru Takemitsu, and he wrote a marvelous film score in the style of Mahler for Kurosawa's film Ran, which is King Lear. And Kurosawa said to Takemitsu, I want it to sound like Mahler. And Toru said, if you want Mawa, he said, you use Mahler. And Kurosawa said, no, I want your music. Right. It's a fabulous score. But at the very end, and I'd forgotten this until I watched it, after I'd written The Shackled King, he ends with claves. And I'd completely forgotten this. And I don't know whether this subconsciously fed into me or it's just, I'd like to think it's just coincidence.
There's also, I don't know if it's naughty to mention this, but Tragoedia by Harrison Birtwistle, which Tragoedia, tragedy, drama, which is a drama just for instruments. But he does that, doesn't he? There are bits where he gets the players to use claves. That's the only other example.
Yes,
of something like
actually, I'd forgotten that.
Right, okay. Yeah, I just wondered if there was something there because it's a drama, but for instruments. The other music, though, the Motto Perpetuo, which is the really complex one, and we've had this conversation, you and I, behind the scenes, because we were colleagues at Manchester for a while. John gave me a job at Manchester, so that's why I'll only ever ask him nice questions. We talked about the difficulty of writing fast music.
Yep. And
that, for me, was the most striking thing about this opera, was this Motto Perpetuo, which, to me, it seems to start as a fragment, as an afterthought, and it gradually develops each time you hear it. And for me, it's kind of like an engine which propels the whole thing forward because it accumulates in energy. And I think it eventually becomes the storm, or a storm. So, yeah, could you talk a little bit about that music and the difficulty of writing fast music, but also in the context of a narrative drama, that you managed to get that in and its role in there?
Well, there are two things about King Lear. One is Lear's gradual realization that he made a big mistake with his most precious daughter, Cordelia, and this growing sense of regret. Simultaneously, there is a growing sense of rage. And the Motto Perpetuo is a metaphor for rage. And as his rage increases, whether it's through the storm or at the very end when he realizes that Cordelia is dead and he shouts, "Howl, howl," and then we're off again. It's all part of channeling and realizing something of that music, that rage, that theatrical rage, that human rage through music. And John Tomlinson as Lear is the most credible and magnificent person to do this because he can carry that weight with him. And he is a kind of it's almost as though he's whipping along the instrumentalists into increasing levels of energy.
So this storm music is it's a metaphor for a psychological state.
No, it is.
Yeah. And okay, I mean the other examples that I was wondering about the Tempest, if there's something of that in there. I mean, I wish Michelle Assay was here because she knows much more about Shakespeare. But also Peter Grimes, of course, the metaphor of the storm happening in it. But it's also
it's a very good subject for a whole discussion. Composers and storms. Yeah, storms in music. Composers and storms. Yeah.
But was the Tempest an illusion? No, it wasn't that.
No.
Even as a thought. Okay.
No.
The other thing that struck me is that we're going to end with a clip in a second before we open to questions of coming from scene 2 where Cordelia is taking on the part of the fool. A lot of the piece is the fool, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why is that?
He was crucial in the play as the one person who could stand up to Lear. There's a wonderful book that Michel lent me called, I think it's The Tragedy of Lear by Grigory Kozintsev, a Russian writer, who talks a lot about the fool, who's actually not a fool at all. He's a philosopher. He's very, very wise. And there are lots of polarities in King Lear of innocence and the way the other daughters are totally insincere. You've got the polarity of Lear beginning in the palace but ending up on the heath and in the hovel. And you've got the two aspects of blindness in the play, that Lear is completely blind to the foolishness of dividing his kingdom in the way he does. And you've got the literal blindness of Gloucester, who is blinded. And the one person who actually illuminates the truth for Lear, apart from Lear realizing himself that it comes from Cordelia, is the fool.
It's the voice of truth.
And Kozintsev is very amusing. I decided that in order to give the fool some kind of extra character, because the fool is also played by Rosanna Madilos, who sings Cordelia, I'd give the fool a rattle.
Which to me related to the claves somehow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. And this is a rattle made of shells that I found in a music shop in Berwick-upon-Tweed, and I like the sound of them, so I thought I'd use them. But I read Kozintsev's...
No product placement here, please.
What's that? Reading Kozintsev's book, I couldn't believe it. He said, of course, the fool is, talks about the fool in very interesting ways, and the one thing that you must not do is give the fool a rattle. And I thought, I couldn't believe it, and it was too late, and I don't regret it.
But the fact that it's seashells, I was going to try and develop the Grimes thing and the seaside, but you've said there's nothing there. So
No.
Okay. Should we hear that final clip?
Sure.
How dost thou? Woe that too late repents. Does any here know me? Why, this is not Lear! Does Lear walk thus? Speak thus? Where are his eyes? His eyes? Sleeping or waking? Sure, 'tis not so. Who is it that can tell me who I am? Who I am? should be false persuaded. I had daughters.
Which they will make an obedient father. Oh, sir, you are old. Nature in you stands on the very verge of his conformity.
Ye heavens, give me that patience I need. If it be you that stir these daughters' hearts against their father, touch me with noble anger.
Thou wouldst make a good fool.
Let not women's weapons, water drops, stain my man's cheeks. No, you unnatural hags, I will have such revenges on you both. Oh, most small fault, how ugly didst thou in Cordelia show, which like an engine wrenched my frame of nature from the fixed place, drew from my heart all love, and added to the gall. Judgment out. I did you wrong.
Canst tell how an oyster makes his shell?
No.
Nor I neither. But I can tell why a snail has a house.
Why?
Why to put's head in? Not to give it away to his daughters. And to leave his horns without a case.
I will forget my nature. So kind a father.
Truth's a dog must kennel, he must be whipped. Prithee, uncle, keep a schoolmaster that can teach thy fool to lie. I would fain learn to lie.
And you lie, sirrah. We'll have you whipped.
They'll have me whipped for speaking true. That have me whipped for lying. And sometimes I am whipped for holding my peace. I had rather be any kind of thing than a
Fantastic work. So,
Thank you. I mean, the remarkable thing about this is that there was no stage director. They designed this themselves, the two singers. No conductor, very little rehearsal time. And it has grown over the performances they've given. And I must say, on particularly Rosanna, she's developed marvelously, not only as a singer, but as an actor as well. And the two of them make a fantastic pairing.
well, that's all the questions I had to ask you. So, John Casken. So I think we've got about 10 minutes if there's any questions from the floor. I don't know if anyone's monitoring, if there are any questions on the online thing, but we've got a roving mic in the room. So if you've got a question, now's the time.
Just the mic.
One over there.
Oh, thank you. I like your music, but one of my questions is just I just want you to talk about like the English libretto and the music style, because I found your music style is very, how do you say, it's the German style, or just I say the music of the opera under the like a German or Europe heritage, which is I like it. I like the German music very, very well. But I'm asking you this question is because in China, actually I'm from China, we always use Chinese to write this kind of music and opera. But for me, when I listen to this kind of opera, I feel a little bit of embarrassment. Use Chinese, But I don't quite, familiar with like an English-speaking opera. Because for me, I heard many English, theater is just like a music theater, like from American music theater. But for the English opera, under your music style, so have you think about, in the future, you use some other language to compose this kind of music? Because in China, maybe if I use Chinese music, libretto, maybe if I want to write more Germanic, or say the German style music, I will use some maybe another language. I will not choose the Chinese to compose. So maybe I just want you to talk about this one. And thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm not quite sure. Are you saying that the drama and the text are quintessentially English, but the music is not?
Yeah, because for me, because you also talk about, today we talk about many German composers, like Berger, Alban Berger, and maybe Richard Strauss or something. And because one thing is many years ago, I heard from YouTube, there was an English version of Mozart's La Nozze di Figaro. For me, it's a little bit hard for me to continue to listen to this kind of opera. So, but today I think it's okay. I like your music, but I just want you to discuss or to talk about, will you use some other language in the future to compose, or have you think
I'm
about
still trying to find the language I've been looking for the last 60 years. So what I would say is that just in the same way that Shakespeare is a universal language and appeals to mankind across the globe, I would like to think that my music could be performed in any country, and it speaks for itself, because it certainly draws on Germanic music, it draws on French music, it draws on some jazz that I've become more and more keen on recently, and there's a lot of English music in there. There's a lot of Purcellian touches in the music. There is some Britain, and it's a kind of a melting pot of different things, which, I feel very strongly that art is born of experience. And as I experience and absorb different musics, they come in, and they belong in there, but they come out in their own way to form scores like this, and I can't really change that. So if you're asking if I would change my musical language to compose something different, no.
Non-music language, just like a libretto, or...
Yeah, I think it means the text.
Oh, the
Yeah,
text.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
You'd use a different language.
No,
Shakespeare's another language, but...
I set some poems by Verlaine. I wrote some songs, chansons de Verlaine, and I sent a score to the French composer Henri Dutilleux, and he was very polite, and he said, I wouldn't dream of setting texts in English, and therefore, by implication, what the hell do you think you're trying to do? by
It's a very
trying to
beautiful
set
piece
the
of
French
yours.
language, even though I had put the songs past friends of mine who speak perfect French, and they said, that's fine. Monsieur Dutier said, not so sure about that. So I think, if you speak English, then, you stick with that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Dan.
Thank you. Thanks for a great conversation. Picking up the Grigory Kozintsev book that you mentioned with King Lear, a question and then a tentative link for you is that Kozintsev is primarily a director.
Yeah.
Have you seen his adaptation? It's heralded as one of the...
I've seen the film,
absolutely.
yes.
And Shostakovich wrote the music. Some of it's become more famous that Shostakovich published a suite of songs from it, in particular the Fool's songs.
Yeah.
And one of those uses the tune of Jingle Bells. And for Shostakovich and in his setting, it's all about shaking and rattling. And of course, as you'll know from the book, I suppose, and Michelle will be able to talk more, that in Russian culture, the fool, the Yurodivy, as in Dostoevsky in the Brothers Karamazov, the holy fool is the one who speaks sacred truth as well. So I know you talked about sort of fool, but there's some further links with Kozintsev's film and Shostakovich, and again, the role of the fool and the shaking as well, just as a tentative link. I just wanted to know more about that film or those other adaptations.
Yes, I mean, I saw it not before I wrote the work. I think I was well into it before I became aware of it, which is, I should have been more aware of it, but I wasn't. And I found it fascinating. And I found it fascinating to read his book, and particularly his comments on the working relationship with Shostakovich, in what he wanted from music and what Shostakovich wanted in terms of wanting to write the music for it. In a sense, I'm rather glad that we didn't have a stage director, because they can often, make certain demands. And I remember when I wrote Golem, there's a point in the opera where, a golem is, from the Jewish legend, is an artificial man of clay who has been made by the rabbi, the chief rabbi, to protect his community. And it all goes wrong. I'll not say how, but it goes wrong. Anyway, the community come and they taunt the golem. And I'm thinking about the sort of music to write for this. And I found myself being drawn to Kurt Weill with a kind of a nod in the direction of Fiddler on the Roof as well. Not because I wanted to show that I could do it, but it just seemed right. And Pierre Audi, who was the stage director, I overheard him say, when he'd heard this music, "How could John do this to me?" And for me, that was a triumph. Because I knew that it rubbed him the wrong way, in the same way that the music was going to rub the golem the wrong way.
Are there any final questions? Are there any? And is there anything online? Okay. Barbara's got one.
Thank you very much for helping us understand a little better the Shackled King. It's great to hear you talking, and also to hear about the sort of your relationship with literature, really, with words. That's fascinating. I wanted to ask about the ensemble. You said you've written for that ensemble a few times. Could you tell us a little bit more about that choice? Thank you.
Yes, there are three works. The first one is Deadly Pleasures, as I said, with a narrating voice. The second one is Kokoschka's Doll, with John Tomlinson as Kokoschka. And then this is the third one. And it's a sort of a small orchestra, but a very unbalanced one. You've got a stringed instrument, a brass instrument, a wind instrument, and the piano who does everything else. The saxophone, the trumpet, and the piano are really powerful. The violin's not. And that was a big problem, to constantly have to bear in mind that balance problem. One of the good things is that you can use a trumpet with many different kinds of mutes, so you've got a huge range of colors, and you've got all the different saxophones. And we didn't hear the very beginning of this, but just shortly after it starts, when the claves start, the instrumental sounds are the piano holding down silently the keys in a particular register, but then hitting very hard low notes on the piano simultaneously with slap-tonguing on the low notes of a baritone sax. And you cannot believe that this sound is coming from just this tiny ensemble. So whilst it's very difficult, it's also extremely rich. It makes for a very practical opera. It makes festival directors think, oh, well, maybe we could afford this. It's 2 singers and 4 instruments. I do want to write another...
That was my last question.
Your last question. There you go. Got there before you. I do want to write another opera, and I've got an idea. I wanted to write an opera 10 years ago, but nobody was interested.
As I said, you win prizes when you write operas. So.
Yeah, well, tell that to the promoters. And I was talking about this the other day with Barry Millington. He said, well, what sort of forces are you thinking of using? And I was telling him, and he said, stop there. It's not practical. In this climate, you'll not get it done. So if you can write an opera for 3 instruments and 2 singers. So that's the next question, obviously, is this an opera?
Actually, are you going to write more operas? But
I would like to, but yeah.
And what?
Well, no, I can't.
Secret. Is it an opera then? I mean, I don't know how much I care what box it fits into.
Deadly Pleasures is a melodrama. Kokoschka's Doll we called a monodrama because it's a bit like Erwartung. There's one voice with a huge vocal expression, but it's one. For this, I got rid of both mellow and mono, and I called it simply drama. But actually, I regret not calling it chamber opera, because it is. It has the emotional range of an opera. It dwells in a very... I don't say this from the musical point of view, but as a piece of tragedy, the touching relationship between 2 human beings, which is both tender and extremely full of hurt as well. So yes, and I think making the ensemble behave like an orchestra. So it's kind of bigger than it ought to be, really. So yes, maybe a chamber opera.
Right. Well. Wonderful chamber opera. Thank you, John Casken.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. And I think we're going to have some wine, but before that, Barbara's going to take over and something important is going to happen.
I've got one I can walk around with. This has been a little while in coming, and... Okay, sorry. Oh, yes, my goodness, right. This has been a little while in coming because of the pandemic and then for all sorts of other practical reasons. But it is wonderful to gather here together to reward and to celebrate the inaugural Royal Musical Association Tippett Award, Tippett Medal. There is a story there. During the pandemic, the Royal Mint closed. It then reopened, but then there was a rather significant event. There was a change of monarch. And so for casting new medals, the Royal Mint has been rather preoccupied with a certain new king. However, we felt it was important to do something and to mark this occasion. And John Casken already has a huge reputation. He's one of the most renowned composers in Britain. He also has a very important international reputation. He writes for every genre, and today we heard just how well and how important drama of all sorts, whatever we call it, is to John, and that relationship with text. I found that particularly exciting. So you have already many accolades, and we are simply adding to them. But it is my honour to award you the Royal Musical Association Tippett Medal, inaugural medal from 2020.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Very much indeed. It has been a long time coming, but knowing that I took second place to King Charles, that's fine. Camden's already mentioned this, that my first opera, Golem, won the Britain Award, the first Britain Award. So for this work to win the first Tippett Medal is particularly important to me, especially as I knew Michael Tippett. I was deeply touched when I received the news about this. the people who made the Shackled King possible, apart from Deborah Calland and Barry Millington, whose ideas for the turning Lear into a music piece or an opera that came from them, the Marianne Stegman Foundation, the RBW Trust, the Ida Carroll Trust were very, very supportive, as was the University of Manchester, where Michel Assay organised a Shakespeare and Music Conference and made this a central feature of their conference. So I'd like to thank them all for that, and particularly the RMA for coming up with the idea and awarding me with this wonderful presentation. When I was in Newbury on Tuesday evening, I told the performers that I was coming here today to receive this. And I said, what I'm going to say is that I'm going to thank you, but actually I would like to receive this on behalf of all of them. Because without them, what you've seen today would not be possible. And what they've given me, particularly the opportunity to work with John Tomlinson, who has always been a hero, but my goodness me, what a towering figure he is. And to be able to work alongside Rosanna as a young mezzo-soprano and to see her grow and blossom in the role has been fantastic. And the musicians of Counterpoise gave me all the support I could ever wish for. So I accept this humbly from you, but I would also like to accept it on behalf of all my performers, and I thank you for it.
Thank you, John. I think you've set the bar very high for the Tippett Medal for the future. And as we had the quotation from the jury members that talked about the quality of the imagination and also the future of this work, let's hope there are more performances like the one you had earlier this week.
Very nice to think so. Thank you very much indeed.
Great. Well, please join us for a glass of wine.
Thank you.
Okay.